Hello and welcome. Welcome back, that is. This is part two of a series on ethics and ethical thinking. We're going to be looking at today about three parts of morality. Now, last time we did look at the men without chest, which was kind of from a meta ethical point of view. And today, this three parts of morality really is also from a meta ethical point of view. But we're going to look at like the broad strokes of ethics and kind of see like what sorts of questions get asked and how many parameters of ethics there are. So if that interests you, you're in the right place. And so I'm going to move over here and start our screen share. And we're going to jump right in, just right into the actual reading on Men Without Chest. Now, I chose this little piece because it's very accessible. But what C.S. Lewis is doing here is not unique. He's actually probably borrowing this from Thomas Aquinas and also from Plato and from Aristotle. So I am going to come over here and we're just going to jump right in. Like when I open this up with students, with this tiny little reading, as we can see, it's a 3-pager, one of three. It has this, and then a little bit of the third page. And you can see it is excerpt from Mere Christianity, which I highly recommend. It's a great book. And why pick this? Well, because Lewis is a master of the English language. And, I could assign students a section of the Summa or something, but that is notoriously dense and difficult to read. And you'll find Lewis is very accessible as we keep going. So as we can see here, the three parts of morality, let's jump right in. He says there are two ways. Oh, I thought you said there were three. Well, he'll start with two. This is some nice rhetorical advantage here. So there are two ways in which the human machine goes wrong. One is when human individuals drift apart from one another or else collide with one another and do one another damage by cheating and bullying. The other is when things go wrong inside the individual, when the different parts of him, his different faculties and desires and so on, either drift apart or interfere with one another. He says you can get the idea plain. Let's put it this way. You can get the idea plain if you think of us as a fleet of sailing ships in formation. The voyage will be a success only in the first place if the ships do not collide and get in one another's way. And secondly, if each ship is seaworthy and has their engines in good order. As a matter of fact, you cannot have either of these two things without the other. He says, right here. He says, if the ships keep having collisions, they will not remain seaworthy for very long. On the other hand, if their steering gears are out of order, they will not be able to avoid the collisions. So the first part and the second part of morality, he says, is down here. In fact, we got to get to the third paragraph here to really see what the three parts of morality are. And he says here this. He says, morality then seems to be concerned with three things. I thought you said there were two. Well, there are three. And he eventually gets to that third thing in this paragraph we just skipped. But let's look at how he phrases them first. And we'll get this stuff on the board, just in our notes. So he says, first, morality is concerned with fair play and harmony between individuals. Secondly, with what might be called tidying up or harmonizing the things inside each individual. And then thirdly, human life, the general purpose of human life as a whole, what man was made for. So I am going to put these three up on our board, for lack of a better word. Number one, morality is concerned with fair play and harmony between, I'll just use that for a shorthand, between individuals. Then secondly, he uses this Britishism, tidying up. He says, also is concerned with tidying up. And he uses the word harmony again. But this is not a harmony between individuals. It's harmony within a single individual. Okay? And then third one is going to be the general overall purpose of human life as It's, how did we, oh, there we go. I forgot how to hit the back button. As a whole. Now later, to get this more to make sense here, later he's going to call these, this one he's going to call man's relationship with other men, or just shortly, others. Oh. Man's relationship with others. This one is going to be man's relationship with himself. And this one is going to be man's relationship, he says, with the power that made him. And this is going to be with one's creator, or the relationship with God. Or you can say this one really has to do with, let's put this, actually, let's actually make it above here, since I've got more space here. This really has to do with your worldview, and I'll explain more of this as we go on, because this one is the most difficult to understand. All right, so let's pull that away. Those are our 3 parts of morality. All right, we'll come back to this board here in a sec. Let's go back to the reading. So, okay, so as we go back up here, you can get a little bit of understanding now. He's making sense, right? The voyage to be success, right? And so basically you, so he says the first part is when we make sure that we play nice, do well with others, make sure that we're not harming one another, right? And this one is going to be, well, our own steering gear needs to be in order. We need to tidy up within the individual, make sure that we're cultivating virtue and avoiding vice, okay? And he says, he gives the analogy of the ships, of course, and then he says, or you can think of another analogy of a band playing a tune. To get a good result, you need 2 things. Each player's individual instrument must be in tune. That would be the second part of morality. That needs the tidying up, the harmony within the individual. And also, each must come in collective harmony with others at the right moment so as to combine with all the others, right? That's that first part of morality. But there's one thing we have not yet taken into account. We've not asked where the fleet is trying to get to, or what piece of music the band is trying to play. The instruments might all be in tune, might all come in at the right moment, but even so, the performance would not be a success if they had been engaged to provide dance music and instead basically played funeral music. And he said, however well the fleet sailed, its voyage would be a failure if it were meant to reach New York and actually arrived in Calcutta, India. So he delineates these 3 parts of morality. That first is going to be fair play, harmony between individuals, playing nice, just don't hurt each other, right? This one is interesting because it's not just not hurting others, it's not hurting yourself. Now, this allows for a really interesting thing. Let's put our board back up. So let's get clearer on what he's claiming here. So this is make sure that you don't harm others. That is, no harm to others, right? And do good to others, right? Because, I mean, we can't just go through life just making sure that we don't hurt each other, right? It's more than that. Morality is not just avoiding bad things. It's also doing good things. It's both the negative and the positive. So this is, of course, with others, both the negative and the positive. But similarly down here, this will be doing no harm to self, right? Consistent with what our pattern is, and also doing good to self. Now, at this point, I say to students, I'm like, this harm right here, he does not mean physical harm, of course, right? Because these are not the 3 parts of physical nature. These are the 3 parts of what? 3 parts of morality. So he means moral moral harm. And then I asked them, what is that? Like, what does it mean to morally harm yourself? Like, we don't think about this enough, to be honest with you. What does it mean to morally harm yourself? Like, and they get really perplexed about that. They're like, well, I don't know. I mean, maybe lying to yourself, because lying is a moral bad. And actually, that's a really good guess, because lying to yourself is a moral harm. But what makes it a moral harm, right? So, like, in order to explain what a moral harm is, it's best to start out with what a harm is, right? What is actually a harm itself. So in order to understand what a moral harm to self is, let's back up, think what it means to morally harm another. And in fact, back up even further and just think about what it means not to morally harm another, but to just harm another person, right? Just think about physical harm. I'm hurting them in some way, right? So that's physically harming another person, right? But certainly I can morally harm another person without even laying a finger on them, right? In other words, I can wrong them in some way, right? So a harm, in some sense, let's put it down here. A moral harm is, in some sense, we'll put a question mark here, to wrong a person in some way. To wrong a person in some way. So, okay, so certainly to another person, as up here, right? I can wrong another person without laying a hand on them. I can morally harm another person without laying a hand on them. How would I do that? And I have them to give me examples. And then, of course, they come up with the idea of like, well, I can lie to someone without hurting them physically. I can lie about their reputation, right? I can destroy their reputation without hurting them physically. I can cheat them. I can do a lot of things, right? I can practice all these injustices to another person without hurting them physically, right? That would be a moral harm. Okay, now down here, how would I do that to myself? How can I morally harm myself, right? That would be taking all those things that I've morally harmed or done a wrong or an injustice to another person and doing it to myself. And then I ask them for examples, and they slowly come around to, well, probably when I, as I said at the beginning, lying to myself. But what does that mean? Well, it means that in some sense, I am presenting something that's not the truth to myself, and I'm actually myself believing that, right? And that's a bad thing, right? And so how would we lie to ourselves? It's a very interesting thing. Maybe that's a video we can talk about later, but it's an interesting puzzle how you could lie to yourself if you're the one who's doing it. Wouldn't you know it? But really, it might mean something like this. It's the idea that you are doing something that is inconsistent with your own confessed personal values or moral values, right? So I'm doing something that's inconsistent with my moral values, and in that way I'm harming myself. In other words, I'm lacking integrity, or I'm failing to live up to my own moral standards, whatever it may be, right? What are other ways that I can morally harm myself? Maybe you guys can say so in the comments, some things, what you might guess as to might be some moral harms. But yeah, these are going to be things that, either I'm lacking integrity or I'm lying to myself. In other words, this moral harm to myself, what could it mean? It's this: when I'm morally harming myself, I'm in some way, let's get another color on here. I'm in some way practicing vice, or cultivating vice. And when I'm doing good to self, again, that's moral good to myself, I am building myself up really well to cultivate virtue. Okay? So this is the practice of cultivating virtue and avoiding vice. Again, so this is tidying up, having harmony, right? And this makes sense if you go back to the analogies that Lewis started with, right? With the ship, it's like make sure my sails are in the right order, making sure my rigging gear is rigged properly, that sort of thing. Steering gear is in order, right? In other words, I'm tidying up my own house so that I don't hurt other people, so that I don't run into other people and harm them. And he says that these two are going to be intimately linked together. If I try to do this one and don't do that one, that is, if I try to get by play nice with other, but I'm actually not well-formed individual, morally speaking, I will eventually also fail at that first one. Because if I'm not well-formed, morally speaking, I'm going to hurt other people, right? And similarly, if I try to do this one and don't worry about other people, right? I'm just myopically obsessed and focusing on my own faults, but I'm not really, playing well with others. I'm hurting them. Well, that in turn will make me into a terrible person, right? So ideally, these two are intimately linked to one another. You can't have one without the other. All right. We need to say more about what this means, but we'll say that as we go. So with that, let's go back to the reading. Now that we know what the parts of the morality, 3 parts of morality are, we can say more about kind of how they unfold. So he says here, right. So he says here, thirdly, the third one, we didn't read this part. Morality is concerned with the general purpose life, human life as a whole, what man was made for, what course the whole fleet ought to be on, what tune the conductor of the band wants it to play. Then he starts into this. He says, you may have noticed that modern people are always nearly thinking about the first thing and forgetting the other two. All right. In other words, this first part of morality, this top level, and let me put this back up. He says this top level is almost universally the only real thing that anybody ever thinks about. And in fact, when I'm teaching on this and setting it up for later sections of the class and the syllabus, I have them know that we're going to see these 3 parts of morality again when we get to sections on law, because most laws are made at this level. Most laws are made at this level. So, because society only really cares to make sure that you play nice and well with others, that you don't hurt one another, that, and that makes sense too, right? Because it's really hard to make a law so that you become a virtuous person, right? But let's see what he says. He says, modern people are nearly always thinking about the first thing and forgetting the other two. And he says, when people say in the newspaper, we are striving for Christian moral standards, this was a different time in the 1940s, they usually mean we are striving for kindness and fair play between nations, classes, and individuals. That is, they are only thinking of the first thing. And then he says this, what about a man who says this, right? When he says, it can't be wrong because it doesn't hurt anybody else. First of all, this is certainly not a true thing, right? Because I can do immense moral wrong even though I'm not harming another person, right? How? Well, because I violate those other 2 parts of morality. But he says here, when a man says that, well, it's not wrong because it can't hurt anybody else. He's only thinking of the first thing. He's thinking that it doesn't matter what his ship is like inside, providing he does not run into the next ship. And he says, and it's actually quite natural and it's forgivable and it's understandable why most people of society will start with that first thing with social relations. And he gives us 2 reasons, right? So he says, for one thing, the results of bad morality, that is when things go wrong in that first sphere, the results of bad morality in that sphere are so obvious and press on us every day. War and poverty and graft and lies and shoddy work. That is, when you talk about the first part of morality, let's go back to this. The first part of morality, it's really obvious when I've harmed other people. It's really obvious when I hurt someone. In other words, stabbing someone, that's very explicit and outward and noticeable, right? It's observable. It's not as obvious down here when I lack a certain virtue, for example. If I just don't have let's say I lack integrity. It's not really obvious. It's not really obvious when I have a vice, right? You would actually have to spend a lot of time with me in order to know whether I have that vice or not. Or if I lie to you, that again, lying one time doesn't make you a chronic liar. It's maybe good evidence towards that direction, but right, anybody can lie, even an honest person can lie. So just doing it once, that doesn't really solve the issue as to whether I have the virtue or the vice, right? So You would have to spend a lot of time with me to know, right? And so things up here in this sphere are really obvious when I stab somebody, right? Not obvious if I have a certain virtue or not, right? I can't tell when you have a certain virtue. I can't even tell when I myself have a certain virtue or not. Do I have integrity? Well, I don't know. I mean, I spend a lot of time with myself, so I've seen myself, but still, like, there's no blood test for integrity. It's not really obvious if you have it. So it's really not obvious. And then he says the second reason why society starts with that first part of morality, he says, and also, as long as you stick to the first thing, there's very little disagreement about morality. Almost all people at all times have agreed, at least in theory, that human beings ought to be honest and kind and helpful to one another. But then he says, he says that, and this is what he means, right? So most of the people up here at this level can agree on this. Like, it is wrong to hurt people. It is wrong to lie to people. It is wrong, right? To disrespect people, whatever it may be. Down here, so at this level right here, this is going to have the most agreement. Then as you go down, less agreement at the second level, and then at the third level, you're going to have the most disagreement, right? So as you progress down here, highest amount of agreement and convergence on things that you agree on are going to be had at that first level. Most people can agree that hurting people is wrong, but fewer people are going to agree what a certain virtue or vice is. And then by the time you get to the third level, you're talking about ultimate things like worldviews and whether God exists and so on. So you're going to have a lot of disagreement. So all that to say, it is really obvious and understandable why people not only start at that first level, but that's all they ever get to, is to talk about only the first level. But then he says this: although it's natural and understandable to start, right? He says, although it's natural to begin with all that, if our thinking about morality stops there, we might just as well have not thought at all. He says, unless we go on to the second thing, the tidying up inside each human being, we are only deceiving ourselves. Okay, well, what do you mean, Lewis? He says this: what is the good of telling the ships how to steer so as to avoid collisions, if in fact they're such crazy old tubs that they cannot be steered at all? In other words, what is the good of drawing up on paper rules for social behavior if we know that in fact our greed, cowardice, ill temper, self-conceit, and so on are going to prevent us from keeping them? In other words, let's bring this back up, our board. He says, at this level, let me just give you an example. Think about a time when you see like widespread corruption, like whether it be like police brutality or whether it be like corporate greed, corruption, that sort of thing, and things just go wrong on a systemic level, right? And ask yourself, okay, you have that picture in mind. Ask yourself, what usually happens in order to fix it? Like, what do people try to do to fix it, right? By and large, what people do more than anything is they do policies. In other words, they just keep making more rules not to hurt each other, right? So with police brutality, what do? They say, all right, we're going to make you do sensitivity training so you don't hurt others. We're going to have body cams to protect hurting others, right? Notice what they don't ever do is they don't ever actually make rules down here at this level, right? Wouldn't it be much easier, that is, if you had rules at this level? Sorry, not rules, but if you focused on this level and that you had morally good people with virtues who would do and follow the rules that you had already set up here, right? You wouldn't need more rules, right? In other words, wouldn't it be nice if you just hired a bunch? I mean, I'm not saying this is easy to do in order to, like, you would have to change your hiring practice perhaps, but wouldn't it solve a lot of problems, let's say, if instead of implementing more policies, which people are just going to, find little loopholes to get out of, right? Even even a terrible, horrible person can jump through a loophole and find, no matter how many policies you put up, wouldn't it be much more efficient if you just focused on hiring morally good, upstanding people who would follow the rules that you had already had in the first place? In fact, they would be such morally upstanding people that you wouldn't really need to police them. They would just do the right thing naturally. So I hope that goes to show that you can't just stop at the first level. You have to go on to the second level, right? Because he says here, let's go back. He says, here, right here, he says, it's easy enough to remove the particular kinds of graft and bullying that go on under the present system. In other words, you can try to rehaul the system. You can try to implement new policies, right? You can try to fix policy, make new rules, and implement body cams, do more sensitivity training, and do all that. But he says, as long as men are twisters or bullies or just terrible people, right, they will find some new way of carrying on the old game under the new system. You cannot make men good by law. And without good men, you cannot have a good society. That is why we must go on to think of the second thing, of morality inside the individual. Now, I'm going to pause there, and I'm going to go to the chat, because I see someone has a comment here, and I really like this. Okay, so he said, many of the illustrations of the second part seem expressed in terms of harm to others. Like the point of cultivating ourselves is to make us better at being moral with others. Now, I will admit that this does have secondary benefit, right? So the way that I'm explaining it now, right, when I'm saying I need to become a good moral person, well, I'm trying to pedagogically show that the value of that does have payoff for that first part of morality, right? But that's only a pedagogical point, right? In order to teach people, like if you're not convinced right now that the second part of morality is really all that worth it, you really are somebody, for example, who thinks, like Lewis described earlier, that morality is all it is just don't hurt other people. Well, you're not going to be really convinced about the second part of morality. You're going to think that you can accomplish that. You can successfully not hurt other people. And, well, it doesn't matter what your ship looks like on the inside. So the pedagogical strategy is here is to show somebody just solely convinced of the utility of that first part, is to show them that, no, in order to get that first part, that's insufficient. You need the second part. Now, in order to do the first part, right? So that now you have another add-on to say you only have the first part. Now you're going to need the second part. So that's what I've been showing so far. No, now that's probably what you're picking up on. It's like, well, all your examples are things that are just showing how it's not hurting others. You're right about that. But I will say this, that this is only part of the value of the second part. The second part of morality is being good for its own sake, right? Being a person of virtue, even when nobody is around who will be hurt by it, right? And Plato talks about this when Socrates is discussing, I think in the Republic with Glaucon. Glaucon is like, the morally good thing and right thing to do is the sly thing, is to try to sneak around and get away with whatever you can get away with, right? Because morality is just a social construct. It's all these rules to make sure you don't hurt each other, right? Socrates says, no, that's not a reasonable thing to do, is to do an unjust bad thing, because to do an unjust bad thing is to disease your own soul. Like, even if nobody ever knew about it, even if you weren't hurting anybody, to do the wrong thing is to harm yourself, like whatever the wrong thing might be. He didn't say in particular what it might be, but yeah. So that view, like even, so doing the right thing in and of itself is valuable, because it would be unreasonable to harm yourself, right? It would be unreasonable. And that's what Socrates says in that discussion. He's like, and that would be unreasonable to disease your own soul. So, but you're right. The examples I've been using so far, but that's only for a pedagogical point, to kind of show the value to somebody who's only convinced of that first part, that you're going to need this second part as well. Okay. It's a good question. Thanks for bringing that up. All right, let's get back to the reading here. And then he says, I do not think we can stop there either. We're now getting to the point at which different beliefs about the universe lead to different behavior. And it would seem at first sight very sensible to stop before we got there and just carry on with those parts of morality all sensible people can agree about. Remember what he said, like most people are going to agree with that first part of morality. Just stop there, right? No, you have to go on to the second part because the second part informs the first part. Well, the third part also, well, I've even felt this teaching sometimes, and sometimes where I'm not as daring or audacious, I'm like, oh, well, we're running out of time. I'm just not going to cover the third part because really you only need to know the first and second part. But so, in other words, I've fallen into this thinking that Lewis is describing, like, oh, well, just don't even worry about the third part. Well, we can agree to disagree or something like that. But let's see what he says. He says, be very sensible to stop before we got on there. But can we? He says, remember that religion, and he's getting into worldview questions here. Religion involves a series of statements about facts, which must be either true or false. If they are true, one set of conclusions will follow about the right sailing of the human fleet. If they are false, quite a different set. Now, a lot of people reading this today are going to be so steeped into relativism, religious relativism, and that's why we looked at Men Without Chest last time, is because religious relativism is a subset of value relativism and a brother of moral relativism. It takes, just like moral relativism takes moral propositions and says, oh, well, that's just relative to you, that's true. Relative to me, that's false. Same thing with religious relativism. It's just like an agree to disagree situation. Like with my perspective, God is real. With your perspective, God's not. And so we can agree to disagree. Now, that is kind of the audience nowadays, especially, and probably Lewis had this similar audience there, but I think it's more so today. But he's reminding us that religion does not make relativistic claims. It doesn't say, well, to me, God exists, and to you, he might not. Religion doesn't do that. It makes truth claims. Any religion whatsoever, makes truth claims about the world, that the world is a particular kind of place and way and exist, and certain things are true and certain things are not true, right? Certain things, if they are true, one set of conclusions will follow about the right sailing of the human fleet. If they are false, quite a different set. Well, give us an example, Lewis. What does he say? He says this. He says, let's just go back to the man who says that a thing cannot be wrong unless it hurts some other human being. He says, this man quite understands he must not damage the other ships in the convoy, but he honestly thinks that what he does to his own ship is simply his own business. But doesn't it make a great difference whether his ship is his own property or not? Does it not make a great difference whether I am, so to speak, the landlord of my mind and body, or only a tenant responsible to the real landlord? If somebody else made me for his own purposes, then I should have a lot of duties which I should not have if I simply belong to myself. And then he'll get into more truth claims down here that Christianity gives. I mean, again, I mentioned that this is from the book Mere Christianity, and you might be thinking, as some of my students do, well, it's Lewis, why are you so favorable towards Christianity? Well, you can blame the BBC for that, honestly, because this book began as radio talks on the BBC in 1943, I believe. Lewis was asked by the BBC to give a defense of Christianity on the radio. So that's what he's doing here. So he's talking about Christianity in particular. Blame the BBC for that. He says, Christianity, one of its true claims is this. It asserts that every human being is going to live forever, and this must be either true or false. Now, if true, he says right here, there are a good many things which would not be worth bothering about if I were only going to live 70 years. But I'd bother about very seriously if I'm going to live forever, right? So he says, perhaps my bad temper or my jealousy are gradually getting worse. So gradually that the increase in 70 years will not be very noticeable, but it might be absolute hell in a million years. Now, this goes to show, let me show you this. He says here that what we say down here at this level informs both this and this. it informs both why we play nice and be nice to others, and why we cultivate the virtues and avoid the vices. Like, just think about if your worldview, for example, is nihilistic. That is, nihilism is from the word nihil in Latin, or nihil. It means nothing. So really, nihilism is something like nothingism. That is the view, basically. Nihilism is the view that no value exists, there we have no purpose, we are just kind of specks on a lonely planet, and we eventually die a heat death in the universe, and there's no afterlife, no gods, no nothing. Just nothing exists, no value, there's no meaning at all. Now, if that is your worldview right here, that is going to inform what you do at the top level, number one, and the second level. Like, why should I play nice with others? Well, I might be somebody like Glaucon, who just plays nice with others because it's out of self-interest. I don't want to get thrown in prison or punished or something, because that hurts, right? Sensory pleasures and pains, basically. I want to avoid pains and get the pleasures. And why would I cultivate my own virtue? Really, only out of self-interest, right? But let me give you another example, one that's really interesting, right? If my worldview, for example, is that, we'll use Lewis examples here in a sec, but one thing that really surprised me is that evangelical Christians, as a demographic in the U.S., tend to not care all that much about, like when it comes to issues up here, in particular, care about environmental issues. Right? They don't really care about that all that much, evangelical Christians, as a demographic. That's just statistics, right? Statistically true. Why? Well, if you know something about their worldview, this makes sense, right? And at this point, I ask students to sort of guess what it might be, like about environmental ethics, that they just like, what is it in the worldview that makes them not care about? I mean, environmental ethics, things like deforestation, pollution, fracking, the ozone layer, carbon emission, all these sorts of things, right? Ocean pollution, all that sorts of things, right? Why don't evangelical Christians care about that? And of course, students will guess and they'll guess and they'll guess. Some will come up with some really good guesses. But the reason I was going for is something like this, and some of those guesses might also have some truth to them, but it is because evangelical Christians, they believe in the rapture, right? They believe that they're leaving this world, so this doesn't matter all that much on a grand scheme of things. Evangelical Christians believe in the rapture. They also believe in the scripture that says that there will be a new heaven and a new earth. And if you have a new earth coming, then you're not going to really care all that much about this one. This one is, it's not like a rental car. You got to make sure everything is like perfectly, wiped down and, no dings on it and everything, no accidents, right? You can do whatever you want to this earth, and you're going to get a new one. So notice how this worldview informs what you do at this level, right? And that's a surprising observation. Like in other words, it is really illuminating. If you can figure out someone's worldview, that will tell you a lot about how they answer ethical questions at the first and second level. Now, what Lewis was saying was, go back to the reading. He says, so if my bad temperature, my jealousy are gradually getting worse, right? The 70 years or forever, right? So if I live only 70 years, in other words, if I don't live forever, right? Because Christianity says I'll live forever. If I live forever, I better care about these minor little peccadillos and character problems that, I'm a jealous person, right? Well, if I'm only going to live 70 years, what's a little bit of jealousy? There's a lot bigger things to worry about. I just got to make sure I'm not murdering people, that I'm nice to people, that sort of thing. A little bit of jealousy is not going to be all that much in 70 years. But in a million years, it's going to build up and be, He says absolute hell. And he says, and immortality makes this other difference also, right? Which has a connection with the difference between totalitarianism and democracy. Now, this is relevant. Zoran Mandami just got elected in New York City, and he ran on socialist Democrat ticket. So he wants to kind of bypass democracy, get democracy to get there, but then he wants to kind of turn it into a totalitarian state and have the government control everything, good and bad. But notice this, he says, immortality makes this other difference. If individuals live only 70 years, then a state or a nation or a civilization, which may last for 1,000 years, is more important than an individual. But if Christianity is true and individuals live forever, then the individual is not only more important, but incomparably more important. For the individual's everlasting, the life of a state or a civilization compared with his is only a moment. So, he says here, to conclude, to wrap up, he says that if we are to think about morality, we must think of all three areas or spheres or departments. He calls these different things, three parts of morality, right? First, this is the thing I listed out to the right here. Relationships between man and man with others, relationships between man and himself, things inside each man, and relations between a man and the power that made him. We can all cooperate in the first one. Disagreements begin with the second and become more serious with the third. It is dealing with the third one that the main differences between Christian and non-Christian morality come out. So, all right, so now that pretty much concludes this presentation on three parts of morality, and I'd love to take whatever questions or comments you guys have at this point. So I'll get to a couple, and then all right. So okay, so you ask who is right. I like you. Welcome. I don't know if I've seen you before. So he says, this is what I ask. Atheist, why be a good person? That's a fantastic observation you're making, and this goes back to the idea of the three parts of morality, right? And we're going to continue seeing this. Like, this is just part 2 in a series on kind of introductory ethical thinking, and we're going to keep visiting three parts of morality over and over and over. When it comes to atheism, right? If your worldview, that third part of morality, it doesn't have grounding, right? And this is what I always talk about too, so I'm glad you're bringing it up. If it doesn't have grounding for what morality is, for what goodness is, for what beauty is, for what truth is, and all these other things, right? If your worldview cannot anchor and answer those questions, then why are you doing the first two things? Why are you trying to cultivate virtue if you're even trying to do that? Why are you trying to play nice with others? I mean, it's going to go back to some sort of self-preservation, right? It's going to go back to the idea that, well, I just don't want to get in trouble. That's not a good reason to be a good person, is so you don't get caught. That's not a real good person. That's just playing like a good person. So I just want to stay in line because the social or legal stuff, right? I socially constructed. Morality is just socially constructed. I'm just going to follow along and just trying to find loopholes where I can to benefit me. But right, so 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 not just atheists, but every single person has to answer that third part. And I tell my students, look, you're going to be answering that third part whether you think you are or not. Right? If you say I don't have any answer, well, that is an answer in itself, because you have no grounding for your morality. And really, at the end of the day, it's just going to be like, I'm just going to do what everybody else tells me to do. That's just not a good grounding in morality. Right here, why not be a good person is an equally valid. Perfect. Yeah, exactly right. Why be a good person? Why not be a good person? Well, I don't know if you meant it this way, but so, I mean, why be a good person and why not be a good person? Why be a good person? Why be a bad person? I mean, there's no rhyme or reason to show why. If you really, like, say you're nihilistic at that third level and you really can't ground morality whatsoever, then you can't ground why goodness is good. You can't ground why goodness is better than bad. You could, like, if you're trying to do that and you're not giving a satisfying answer at the third level, you might be like, well, because people tell me that. Again, like, that's not going to be good enough. You have to give actual, meaningful explanations for where morality comes from. Why are we doing it? Right? Why are we playing nice with others? Why be good? Why be moral? And if you can't really get satisfying answers to that, then you have no rationale for why you're doing the things that you're doing with other people. So why are you becoming a good person? Right. And so some people will say, well, Christians, well, the only reason they're being good people is so that they don't go to hell. And it's like, I mean, that's a straw man, first of all, because that's not the only reason why Christians are good people. They're good people. Well, first of all, morality isn't everything for a Christian. It's only a byproduct of holiness. And so Christians want to become holy because they want to become like Christ. They want to become like God. So that is the whole answer to that. They want to become good because they want to become like Christ. And they want to avoid hell, well, because Christ is not there, right? They want to be where Christ is, right? So it's not just about avoiding punishments. It's about becoming like Christ because one's love for Christ. Right here. Yeah. By the way, my answer to why be a good person is because I want to. Lucky you, I guess, right? Yeah. And again, it's got to be an answer that satisfies and without, just with reading the text here, I don't know to the degree you're joking or not. But yeah, this seems like a joke. Like if your answer is just because, it's almost like when parents are like, oh, just do it because I said so. It's like, no, I'm just going to be a good person because I want to. Well, what happens when you want something else? What happens when you want something opposite? All right. And if you can't give a reasoned, rationale, and explanation as to why that is worse than your first choice to be a good person, right? Like your choice to be a good person versus Ted Bundy's choice to be a serial killer. Like those are equal. If you have no grounding for morality and you can't explain why to be a good person, well, if it's grounded in desires, well, what's stopping you from desiring the opposite sort of thing? All right. Yeah, who's right said, because being a good person gets you nowhere in this world. That's true. That's so true, too. Yeah, the Proverbs had a lot to say about this, and the Psalms have a lot to say about this as well. The wisdom literature, that is, yeah. Now, I want to do this exercise with you guys. I thought I was done, but I'm not actually. So I'm gonna come back over here, and I want to do this exercise with you, where I actually do this in my class. So I want your opinion on this. All right, we're gonna get a little touchy. All right, we're gonna get a little touchy, and let's see. Later on, when we get into our sections on law, because remember, this is a series, and I'm kind of walking you through my my syllabus. In fact, let me show you this syllabus as if you want to see it. I mean, it interests me, so if it interests you, and I hope it does, then you'll be able to see this. Okay. Right here. So I have videos on all this material here. If you want, I'm gonna go ahead and go down, but if you want, you can pause the video there and go back and look. This was our last live that we did a week ago today, and this is the one we just did. Next one, instead of covering, I might do a video on introducing the ethical theories, but the next video is going to be on the trolley problem. And you can see that is alive, ready to go. I have a thumbnail for it, so be there for that. That is a week from today. And then we're going to get into all these isms. These are these ethical theories, right? Ethical egoism, hedonism, utilitarianism, and even later on, virtue ethics. All right. So why was I bringing this up? This is why. Because eventually we will get to, after we discuss ethical theories, and this is down the road. So if you're still here by then, you're doing a great job, right? I mean, if you're in my class, like these poor kids, they have nowhere to go. They have to be there, but like you have the freedom to walk away at any time. But if you are still here during all this, you will learn that by the time we get to this unit on politics, community, and law, we will very much so be drawing upon the three parts of morality once again. And we, like I said earlier, that first part of morality just is making sure you play nice with others, not hurting them, right? So we'll go through the classical authors, Plato, Aristotle, Augustine, and Aquinas. And then throughout these, I like to introduce what I call controversial moral problems, controversial moral issues, let's say. And these are things like things you can almost not say on YouTube, but since I'm not monetized, we're going to say them. Things like pornography, things like incest, things like adultery, even suicide, even polygamy, so on and so forth, right? We cover every single one of these. And we have a debate in class. So if that interests you, be here for it. But the reason why I cover that and let's go back to our 3 parts of morality, is because this. Let's take, for example, by way of kind of demonstrating what it is I'm trying to express here, let's take, for example, pornography. All right. And I want you guys to help me with this, right? This ideally would be like a lively class discussion. And this is where everybody perks up. So if you haven't been in the chat yet, you're probably going to be in the chat now. I want to hear everybody's opinion. All right. So let's take pornography, for example. And I usually ask students, like, what is it that actually, let's not start with pornography. That's too much of a difficult one because people disagree about that. But let's take incest. All right, incest. Let's take incest. All right. And of course, what is it that makes incest wrong? Right? What is it that makes incest wrong? Because that's what these 3 parts of morality are. It's like what makes something wrong, right? And so if we're talking about incest, all right, everybody on board? What makes incest wrong? Let me put that in here. What makes incest wrong? What makes incest wrong? Now, asking this question, most students will immediately jump to that first part of morality. And again, Lewis says this is completely understandable because, after all, most people can agree in society not to hurt others, right? And that's the sphere where things are most obvious, is when people get hurt. And people will immediately jump to what makes incest wrong would be the what's it called? The biological and genetic disorders that you get from, you pass from parent to offspring, right? So if you reproduce, like say a brother and a sister have sex and have a kid, that offspring is very likely to be genetically deformed, okay? So in other words, they're saying that what makes incest wrong is going to be this first part. That's what makes incest wrong. Is going to be because it harms people. Now, suppose we could fix it. We could make it better. We can make it good incest, because you'll see this is what people try to do with morally bad things. They say, we could fix it. Let's make a morally good incest. Let's make an incest where we're not harming anybody, right? And so there is actually a law in the state of Utah where you can marry your first cousin if you are both over the age of 65 and you cannot reproduce, right? So if you have been waiting your entire life to ride off into the sunset and finally be with your first cousin, good old Jonathan. You've seen him from very young as a strapping boy, and finally, you've waited all this time. The state of Utah will let you do that. They will let you marry, and as long as you can't reproduce, you're not hurting anybody, right? They fixed it. They've patched it up. And look, it's not hurting anybody, therefore it's not wrong, right? Now, at this point, obviously, all my students are going to be really grossed out, and they're like, that's terrible, right? This is probably what you're thinking. That's terrible. Why would you do something that terrible? And I remind them, look, it is icky. I agree with you. It's gross. But something being gross or icky does not make it morally bad. So you've got to give me something better reasoning than that. Just it's gross. Okay, what makes it morally wrong? And this is why I tell them, I say, look, you have to, if say the government or an individual or somebody like that is going to block your access to this and fix it, patch it up and say, look, it's not hurting anybody. There's nothing wrong with it. Now you have no access to this. You have to find some resources at these other two levels to show what it is about incest that makes it morally wrong. Right? Like if you can't say, well, it's not hurting anybody. Okay, well, maybe it's that it's wrong, not that it's because it's hurting anybody. Maybe it's wrong because it's harming yourself, morally speaking. You are now the kind of person that sleeps with his sister. That is who you become. You were that person, right? That is a bad reputation to have. And that brings a lot of shame. That's an interesting concept, by the way, the concept of shame. And morally speaking, shame is neither good nor bad in and of itself. It can be good or it can be bad. We mostly think of it as a bad, but this would be a really good instance of good shame, right? If you are somebody who sleeps with his sister, you are harming your reputation. You are harming yourself. You're becoming a person who you ought not to become, right? So you are harming yourself. Okay, what about at this level? This idea that could it be something about the general purpose of human life as a whole that you're violating, right? Is that what makes incest wrong? Suppose I even make it harder. I kind of twist the screws on them. I say, yeah, that law in Utah allows first cousins to marry over the age of 65 and not reproduce. Well, what if, let's imagine a brother and sister want to shack up and be together. Because again, after all, you can't help who you love. Love does not choose who it loves, right? You can't, and I kind of push them on this, right? And, well, suppose they both got the surgery. They both got fixed, spayed and neutered so that they don't reproduce and have children. Does that fix it? Like we've removed access to that number one. They're not hurting anybody. They're not having genetic offspring. What is it that they're doing that is still wrong? Again, we looked at the second part of morality. They could be harming themselves. Or the third part of morality, again, because this is the part where most people disagree on it, this is going to be the hardest level to argue from, but that doesn't mean it's wrong. This is the right and correct way to argue. You could say it's in some way violating the purpose of human lives, right? You could argue this from like a genetic or evolutionary perspective. You could say, well, it's not in keeping with our evolutionary dictum to go out and reproduce and to sow our seed, spread our seed, and repopulate and so on and so on. And you're going to, you can make an evolutionary story about it, right? And so it's not in keeping with the evolutionary biological purpose of human life. Or you could argue here that from a philosophical point of view, human beings are not supposed to shack up with their sisters, right? They are supposed to go out and, meet people, not just go down the hallway and meet people, or you can say, in fact, you could argue from this third point of view, you could say that there are four kinds of loves. Actually, Lewis, interestingly, has a book called The Four Loves. One is eros. This would be erotic love or romantic love. Another is phileo. This would be brotherly love, like the city of brotherly love, Philadelphia. Another is storge. This is affection, love of affection. And the other is agape. And this would be unconditional love. And really, agape is kind of unique because it informs the other three. But eros would be, you could make an argument here, a philosophical argument. You could say, look, I'm not saying it's easy to make. You would have your work cut out for you, but you could argue. You could say, look, erotic love, that is eros, between siblings who should only have storge, that is affection. Affection is like, when I have my son cuddle with me on the couch, right? That's affectionate love. But brotherly love is like, we're bros, we're homeboys, that sort of thing. So you might have this between siblings, brotherly love and affection, but never, you can make an argument that if you have these two between family, it should never turn into erotic love. You could make that argument. It wouldn't be an easy argument to make, again, because you're at the third part and nobody really agrees down here, but that would be the right way to argue. So, all right. So now, yeah, so let me get to some of these comments. So, no cakewalk says, look, from the outside, what you're describing sounds very much like you find incest icky and want to find some reason to enforce that on others. Yeah, I do find it icky, for sure. Yeah, there is this, but that's not only why I find it icky. Up here, we talked about shame, moral shame, but we also, for this, by the way, I would recommend my colleague Sabrina Little. She has a paper on shame as being a passion or an emotion rightly ordered, right? Because any emotion, shame is an emotion, right? Any emotion can be rightly ordered or disordered. It can be used for the good or used for the bad. So shame can be used for the good. And also, there's another emotion here. I mentioned the word icky. That's not the technical term. The technical term would be moral disgust here. Moral disgust. And disgust being an emotion, again, can be properly ordered or disordered, right? And so moral disgust, just like shame, can be a good indicator or a bad indicator, right? I can be morally disgusted over something that's good, right? Because it's a disordered disgust. But if you have a properly virtuous person who is if you have a properly virtuous person who is experiencing moral disgust over something, you better listen to that person because they are a virtuous person and they are rightly ordered, and their moral disgust is going to be at something that is bad and is going to be something that is a good indicator of what is bad, all right? Because they're disgusted by what's truly bad. So, but this, of course, is assuming that you have morally good people as your guide, right? Yeah. So as I said, moral disgust can be a good indicator, but it's not always a good indicator, right? So ideally, it's nice to think about these things like shame and disgust, but it's like, again, emotions are non-rational. They're not going to be the thing that you want to hang your hat on. They can be good indicators to what's morally true. But ideally, they're not going to be the only thing that is your indicator. You're going to want arguments and stuff. So that's why I'm talking about these three parts of morality. Again, like if access to that first part is blocked off. But here's the thing too. In the case of incest, where they tried to block access to this first part, they actually didn't fully succeed in doing that, right? Because I asked my students this, well, did they fully succeed? Or are you actually harming other people, right? You're not harming your offspring. Is there anybody else you might be harming? Well, you are harming the people in your family, and you're harming your sibling who you're shacking up with, right? This would be a wrong thing that you're doing. In other words, you're bringing shame upon your family. You're disrespecting them. And think about Thanksgiving, man. Thanksgiving's coming up here in the U.S., like where families get together and so on, or any holiday, right? Where you get together. Think about Thanksgiving. And what if you guys break up? Like you now have to try to act like everything's normal and still be brother and sister together. But you are harming your parents they didn't ask for children who sleep with each other, right? But now they will have that reputation, and you did that to them. You harmed them. So this level is still in play. You did not totally eliminate it. Now, the case of the law in Utah, where you're both over the age of 65, maybe those parents aren't still alive, but they might be. You know, I've had relatives live to be over 100, so they might be still alive. And if so, you better not tell them that, Jane and Jack got together, because it would bring shame upon them, right? Or brother and sister or something. You would now be the parent. Think about being that parent. You would be the parent of someone whose children now are married. And it's like, nobody wants to be that person. Some students will say, look, how is this any different from like royals, nobility, them trying to sleep together and, keep the bloodline pure or something like that. Well, usually they don't have it be brother and sister. There are many cases of this throughout history, though, both in Greek mythology, Roman mythology, and in real life, and the Greeks and Romans and throughout history. But Just because there's instances of this doesn't mean that it's actually right. So let's see. Go back to, yeah, you're right. Something being discussing does not make it wrong. And moral disgust is not enough by itself, I'd say. Yeah, exactly. That's the exact same thing I said. Yeah, moral disgust alone is not going to be the thing that determines, right? Because, like, if you're morally disgusted by gay marriage, right? Let's suppose that you are totally fine with gay marriage. Well, somebody being morally disgusted by that is not going to affect you whatsoever. Like, you're going to say this. Well, that's not enough. Like, so what do you think it's icky? It doesn't mean it's wrong, right? So I press my students on this. If they say, oh, well, that's gross, that's why it's wrong, I tell them exactly what you said here. You can't just say that it's gross and just go on about your day. That's a good place to start, perhaps. Let's explore that thought, but we gotta have reasons for why we disagree with that. So let's have a reason for why we think it's morally wrong. And perhaps the reason is sufficient, perhaps it's not. And perhaps the claim that is morally wrong turns out to be false, right? So yeah, so that would just be the starting point in order of kind of getting to exploring moral wrongness or not. So, all right, let's pull this down. Yeah, okay. All right, so one more thing I want to show you guys here. I want to show you what to look out for coming up, because we're winding down here, but I want to make sure that you guys are aware of what's coming up. So we have some upcoming live streams. If you want to call in and discuss the things that we just talked about right now, I want you to call in on Wednesday. This is, I think I can make that bigger. Let me go over to the live tab here, right here. I want you to call in right here. Now it's switched opposite. And this Wednesday office hours is my standing appointment office hours. I'm always there on Wednesday, 4:30 to 7 p.m. Eastern time in the U.S. And you have the ability to call in using microphone and video, and you can ask me in person questions. Like, I want this to be most like a classroom setting as possible. And that would be to either ask follow-up questions from today, or like press me on some things that I may have missed. And I'm totally open to that stuff. I'm very nice and would love to hear what you have to say. And then this other one is, again, proceeding, like I mentioned earlier, in this series on ethics. I'm going to get through my whole syllabus, and maybe I'll then turn to a different class and like teach critical reasoning or logic or medical ethics or ancient philosophy or metaphysics or epistemology, whatever it may be. But right now it's the ethics series, and we are on the world famous trolley problem. And yeah, so I think No Cakewalk, did you leave a comment there in the chat on this already that you liked the thumbnail? And I improved it a little bit more too. So I hope you guys are there for that. Today, we're at the end towards today, but I look forward to seeing you guys when we reconvene on Wednesday. Again, 4:30 p.m. Eastern. I know a lot of people here. Not a lot of people are here at this 2 p.m. time that we're holding sort of this class session, but I want it to be early enough in the day to where we get new people. But this standing office hours appointment is always at the same time. It's a little bit later in the day so that we get people who are waking up in Australia, who are about to go to sleep in the UK, and who are just coming home from work in the United States and Canada. So it seems like a really nice, ideal time. This one I'm just kind of trying out. I may switch the time or not, but this will be the third week that I'm at that Monday at 2:00 time, and we'll just continue with that. So be here for the next ethics lesson here, and be here for Wednesday for the next call-in. So, all right, guys, that is it for us today. I look forward to seeing you there, and take care. God bless. I will see you next one. Bye-bye.